Hey, you guys, welcome to History of Thought 2. And today we're going to be talking about one of my favorite philosophers in the 20th century, Michel Foucault. So, Foucault was born in 1926 and died in 1984. He's a French philosopher, a historian of ideas, a social theorist, and a literary critic, and perhaps one of the most influential Western theorists in the second half of the 20th century. He wrote about the history of ideas about madness, the history of the medical profession, the history of scientific categorization, the development of the modern administrative state, a kind of history of racism, a history of the constructions of sexuality, spaces of otherness and resistance, and the ability to achieve the freedom and progress of the Enlightenment project in a postmodern world. He really does focus a lot on Western culture, in particular European culture, but his ideas have been taken up by a variety of theorists in a number of contexts. And we'll be talking about a couple of the applications of Foucault in later classes when we talk about Edward Said's Orientalism and Judith Butler's queer theory. So what actually unites all of his work? He's known for his arguments about how power operates, the construction of knowledge and systems of knowledge, the historical deconstruction of notions of truth, and questioning Western notions of the objective self and identity. So we identify Michel Foucault as sort of one of the major thinkers of what's called post-structuralism. This is sort of philosophical, hand-wringing, but if you're interested, so to understand post-structuralism, you have to understand the idea of structuralism, which we didn't talk too much about in this class. But structuralism is a 20th century intellectual movement and approach in the social sciences and philosophy that attempts to analyze a specific field or a specific practice or a specific aspect of a society as part of a complex system of interrelated parts. So broadly speaking, structuralism holds that all human activity and its products, even perception and thought itself, are constructed and not natural. And in particular, that everything has meaning because of this sort of social system, cultural system, or language system in which one operates. So it's really about kind of how looking at a system in which meaning is constructed and understood. So the idea that every system has a structure, the structure is what determines the position of each element. It's really kind of an unchanging way of looking at a society. It's really like looking at how things are sort of within a static system, and that structures are real things that lie beneath the surface or the appearance of meaning. And there's a lot of sort of anthropologists and a lot of people who study linguistics who are really into structuralism in the 20th century. So post-structuralists like Foucault are attempting to kind of call this into question. I mean, not that they wouldn't be denying that there's sort of a structure of meaning that underlies sort of practices within a culture, but that meaning isn't fixed, and relationships between sort of people and objects and that sort of thing within the system aren't fixed, and that change can happen. So post-structuralism, of which Foucault is a big sort of proponent, is a more kind of late 20th century, second half of the 20th century movement in philosophy and social sciences, which is sort of in opposition to structuralism. So, for example, in a post-structuralist approach to analyzing a text, the reader replaces the author as the primary sort of creator of meaning. And so there's not as much of a fixation on, well, what does the author mean by creating this? It's more about the meaning created by the person that's consuming it, which can be diverse and unfixed, and there can be a multiplicity of meanings. Some of the key assumptions of post-structuralism that are pushing against structuralism are, the concept of the singular and coherent self is a fictional construct, and that individuals sort of compromise conflict and tensions among knowledge claims, and the interpretation of meaning is dependent on a person's own sort of interpretation, and it isn't sort of like some top-down structure. This is what this cultural practice or this text or this piece of popular culture is meant to say this. It's really about sort of this multiplicity interpretation. And it also means that it's necessary to utilize a variety of perspectives to create a multifaceted interpretation of the text, even if these interpretations are in conflict with one another. So really, when Foucault is looking at culture, and when he's looking at sort of how these cultural practices in Western society over madness, over medicine, over punishment, over sexuality have sort of changed over time, what he's really saying is there isn't kind of this authoritative top down, this is what these things mean and this is how they changed and this is what history is. But, there's a lot of sort of diversity and multiplicity kind of going on underneath it. And there isn't sort of like one authoritative answer to what is the history of X. He's interested in more like, what are sort of the different ways that we got to where we are now, and what are kind of the variety of interpretations that still exist now. So that's, in a nutshell, what post-structuralism is. So for your assignment reading assignment for this week, you have a podcast that's sort of an overview of Foucault that I think is a really clear sort of explication of some of his ideas in Discipline and Punish. But you read 2 excerpts from Discipline and Punish. You read actually the opening pages, the body of the condemned, and then you read a section about the panopticon. We're going to actually be talking about the body of the condemned when we meet for our live class. But, if you want a little bit of a primer on what we're going to be talking about, it's interesting. He starts out this book really showing us, okay, there's this one scene, right? This kind of, we could call medieval overt display of power of the sovereign, right? Where they're torturing the guy who tried to kill the king, right? Where the motivation of the criminal really doesn't matter. It doesn't matter in kind of this medieval, what Foucault will call sovereign model of power. We'll get to that in a minute, about why somebody tried to kill the king. What was the motivation? It doesn't matter. In this model, it's really about an overt display of the power of the sovereign, the power of this one person or one set of institutions at the top of the power hierarchy. And we can talk some about why there is this sort of extensive and public torture, this public spectacle of punishment in this sovereign power model. And then what happens, right? So sort of the second scene he shows us, the first scene is kind of this torture of a guy who tries to kill the king, which in Enlightenment times we would say, oh, that's brutal, that's barbaric, that's how we used to do things. And it's great now, right? It's great now because we're enlightened, right? And we do things like incarcerate people and try to rehabilitate them and set them on a schedule. I mean, that's so much better than just like torturing them to death, right? So in modernity, it's not just about punishment, but about reform. It's about creating certain kinds of individuals during incarceration. It's about changing people from the idea of the criminal to the idea of sort of contributing member of society. So, think about these 2 opening snapshots that he gives us, the torture of this guy who tried to kill the king, and then this schedule of a prison. What do these have to do with power? What is power? What does it mean to have or possess power? And so Foucault is saying that in Western societies with the Enlightenment, you really see this shift, which is reflected in these 2 opening snapshots, sort of the public spectacle of torture against the guy who tried to kill the king versus the timetable from a prison's daily schedule. And he says these are reflective of 2 different regimes of power, which he calls sovereign power and disciplinary power. And, sovereign power is that kind of direct, I have the power to get you to do what I want. And, that's pretty obvious. But what kind of power is elicited in that timetable? And that's what we're going to be talking about more. So the second section of Foucault's Discipline and Punish that you guys read is called the Panopticon. And, this is something else that we'll be talking a lot about, but it's really important to understand the Panopticon because it really becomes kind of this model for his ideas about power. So the Panopticon actually was a real thing created by Jeremy Bentham, an Enlightenment philosopher, as a rational and efficient design for prisons. So each inmate is assigned to an individual cell, which is constructed in such a way so that each separate cell is not visible to the other prisoners, only to a guard at the center. The inmates also cannot see if the guard is actually present in the center or not. Maybe somebody's there, maybe they're taking a break, you don't even know. Therefore, from the perspective of the prisoner, they're never aware if they're actively being monitored or not. However, the possibility always looms overhead that they could be being watched at that time. So they must always act as if the guard can see them in order to evade punishment. What's interesting about this model is that, it doesn't really matter who is doing the watching, who's in the center of the guard tower, or their motivation, or if there's even anyone there. So what happens eventually over time? If you sort of live in this structure for long enough, initially, right, it's like, oh, I don't want to get punished. I don't want to get punished. But Foucault would say, and this is sort of a metaphor for society in general for him, eventually there is no need for the guard at all, as the prisoners internalize the potential gaze of the prison guard and begin to self-regulate their own behavior. So Foucault says in a panopticon environment, quote, there is no need for arms, physical violence, material constraints, just a gaze, an inspecting gaze, a gaze which each individual under its weight will end by interiorizing to the point that he is his own overseer, each individual thus exercising this surveillance over and against himself. So the initial need for the guard is still a demonstration of sovereign power, right? But it's still a demonstration of sort of that power of the king, that power of punishment, right? However, once the prisoner turns the gaze onto themselves and eventually internalizes the behavioral norms that they have been obeying for so long, the guard becomes unnecessary. And this self-regulation is the advent of what Foucault will call disciplinary power. And Foucault says that, the panopticon can be thought of as a model for how a lot of power relationships work in modern times. And it's kind of interesting, I think in the 21st century, this applies even more. Think about why is it that we behave the way we do? Why is it that we act the way we do, that we sort of normalize ourselves to certain norms and standards about how we should behave, what we should look like, what we should eat, what we should consume, what we should read, all these kinds of things? Is it because we sort of fear punishment? We fear sort of that direct kind of power of the king, like, oh, you can't do that, I'm going to torture you. Or is it because of this constant surveillance? We've internalized that gaze and we sort of monitor and regulate ourselves. And so this is really a model that can generalize to all sorts of different other institutions, and I think just sort of life in general and modernity. And that's something we can talk about in classes, how this generalizes. So what Foucault is really talking about here is the switch in the West from sovereign power, from a model of sovereign power to a model of disciplinary power. So disciplinary power is that first snapshot that he gives you at the beginning of Discipline and Punish, right? It's the guy getting tortured because he tried to kill the king. And this is a shift in what Foucault will call the regime of truth, which we'll get to in a minute, is sort of how disciplinary power displaces sovereign power. So sovereign power is power through repression. It's the power of the law to say no and the physical force to punish deviation, right? It's when we think of like power just at its basic, this is what we're thinking about. The power of kings in medieval times, the power of the police in modern times, right? The state's monopoly on the legitimate force of violence. Foucault's not saying sovereign power doesn't disappear. Absolutely. But it's not as prevalent. It's not the way that you sort of manage a population for Foucault, starting in sort of modernity with the Enlightenment. So Foucault would say that in, hold on, just a second. Just move my video for a second. So Foucault would say in the sort of starting in the 17th century, 18th century into the 19th century in the West, a new kind of power becomes dominant that uses mechanisms different from that of sovereign power against that just sort of direct repressive power of law, of the king, of the state, right? Do this or I'm going to beat the crap out of you, right? And he calls this disciplinary power. So faced with an increasing number of bodies, right? Like population is exploding during this time, who are living in closer proximity to one another, right? Because of the Industrial Revolution, population growth, urbanization, capitalism, etc. New techniques are needed to ensure the orderly operation of society. So the development of mechanisms of disciplinary power isn't about sort of using brute exercises of power to get people to behave a certain way, like, okay, you better do this, or, you know, I'm going to beat you up or throw you in jail or whatever. I mean, that still happens, but the way that sort of individuals are controlled and constructed now, it sort of shapes individuals to behave, speak, move, produce in certain ways, not because they have to or fear punishment, because we are socialized within a certain set of discourses, I'll get to that word in a moment, that convince us that these are the appropriate modes of behavior. And Foucault says that disciplinary power has created a, quote, society of normalization. The disciplinary subjects obeyed not because we have to, but because we can't conceive of any other way. So prior to sort of the modern era, the era of enlightenment, what defines individuals is their place in the social hierarchy. And we've talked about this before, right? The feudal system where you sort of place in this hierarchy. You're part of the nobility, the peasantry, you know, the sort of the clergy, or some of these intermediate points in that. But after we become undifferentiated units in a mass of people with capitalism and urbanization and mass democracy and mass society, we also become individual citizens. So what defines us is our action and our behavior. And this is what constitutes our self for Foucault. And, you know, this is really what defines who we are and ourselves, right? And we sort of think about the power of socialization and normalization to sort of have us see ourselves in a certain way, who we are, our identity in terms of, we'll talk about this later, sexuality, our identity in terms of, you know, are we healthy or are we unhealthy, right? Those are really important parts of disciplinary society for Foucault, right? And a lot of it is really about bodies. So for Foucault, disciplinary practices were first cultivated in institutional settings such as the prison, right, with the panopticon, military establishments, hospitals, factories, and schools, all of these places where it becomes really important in terms of organizing bodies and directing bodies in certain ways, getting people to kind of behave in certain ways. And this isn't like this nefarious, like there's somebody at the top, like a king at the top going, ha, 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 I've thought of a better way to control people, right? But just this is sort of comes from the fact of when you have all of a sudden a population of 100 million people instead of 100,000, or you have an institution with 5,000 people, you know, like a university or a military establishment or a hospital that need to be sort of directed and controlled in a certain way for orderly operation, right? That sort of brings about these disciplinary techniques of social regulation and control. And, you know, what's really interesting for Foucault, and this is a feature of modernity for him, is that the key feature of disciplinary power is that it's exercised on the body. So disciplinary practices subject bodily activities to a process of constant surveillance and examination that enables a continuous and pervasive control of individual conduct. So the aim of these practices is to simultaneously sort of optimize the body's capacities, right, to create good workers, healthy members of society, and their skills and productivity to foster usefulness, but also docility. And we'll talk about docility in a second. But, think about in contemporary times, all the cultures of like health that we have. I mean, not only saying you have to look a certain way and your body has to fit sort of a certain normative standard, but think about how this gets sort of reconfigured as, being healthy and eating certain foods and working out and all these kinds of things. I mean, you see some of these advertisements here, right? Is about sort of creating a sense of who you are and what your identity is, right? Well, I'm a person that takes care of my body, and I'm a person that is healthy and doesn't do all these bad things, and how that really becomes some part of our identity. But it also serves a really important function in terms of a society with millions and millions of people in terms of kind of optimizing our capacities and our productivity in a capitalist system, right? I actually, downloaded, an app recently to help me like count how many drinks I'm having a week so I don't drink too much in the middle of a pandemic. But I mean, that kind of self-monitoring. Okay, I'm checking in with the app and I note down all of this stuff, and then like I'm put with a group of people and they all text each other, oh, you're doing great, you've had, you're staying within whatever medical authorities say is, the amount of drinks you should have every week, that sort of thing. I mean, that is what normalization is about. Foucault is not, saying this is good or bad. He's saying this is a kind of power that is certainly different than some kind of sovereign king saying, if you drink more than one glass of wine, I'm going to throw you in jail. But it is just as powerful in a normalizing kind of way. So what's being formed by all these kinds of things is a policy of sort of coercion, but friendly coercion that acts on the body, a calculated manipulation of the elements of the body, the gestures of the body, the behavior of body. The human body is entering Foucault says the human body was entering a machinery of power that explores it, breaks it down, and rearranges it. Thus, discipline produces subjected and practiced bodies, docile bodies. In other words, perpetual surveillance is internalized by individuals, which becomes sort of self-surveillance and a kind of self-awareness that defines the modern subject. It defines who we are. It defines our identities in modernity. So is this a bad thing, right? Is this really such a bad thing? What would Foucault say? I mean, these are all, he's saying, products of the Enlightenment. So, one could see these institutions and their practices as progressive. I mean, isn't it better, and we'll talk more about this in class, but isn't it better that we have rehabilitation of criminals and sort of, people internalizing norms in prison rather than torture of lawbreakers? Isn't it better that we have medical treatments for mental illness rather than madness as being seen as caused by demons? Isn't it better that we have large-scale institutions of public education over, sort of home tutoring and self-learning only for elites? Isn't it better that we have modern medicine over sort of superstitious practices? What's really kind of hard to get about Foucault, but I think it's important to know, is that he's not interested in identifying some truth about punishment, madness, medicine, sexuality. He's interested in understanding how we got to where we are in the present in terms of how we think about and construct knowledge about these topics. And also having us consider that maybe our supposed enlightened practices have just as much an element of control than the previous barbaric ones connected with sovereign power, albeit in different forms. I'm moving my image around a little bit again so you can see some of the images. So what unites all of Foucault's work? I mean, we'll be talking about in class a little bit about madness. You're going to be reading about his book on Discipline and Punish. Later in the class, in I think a week or two, we're going to be talking about his views on sort of the history of sexuality. So all of this might be a little kind of high-end theory now, but this is something that you can come back to when we get to more of the specific examples about his work. So there are a number of things that unite all of Foucault's work on all of these different topics. The first is the focus on discourse. The dictionary definition of discourse is written or spoken communication or debate. But when Foucault uses it, and when we use it sort of in 20th and 21st century philosophy, we mean systems of thought composed of ideas, attitudes, courses of action, beliefs, and practices that systematically construct their subjects and the worlds of which they speak. So it's a system of ideas that we see as natural or taken for granted. I mean, he's using the word discourse to really mean a discursive system. So if you think about all of the different ways we talk about, let's say something like mental illness, which we'll talk about more in class, or when he looked at the history of it, madness, all of the different sort of categories that we have to define it, all of the different kind of aspects of it, right? The sort of, in modern times, the medicalizing aspects of it, the way that we understand and talk about something as sort of a system, right? So there's a modern sort of discourse, a modern sort of medical discourse about mental illness. Now, if you went back 400 years, people would be talking about things like possession by demons, or, sort of the mad is able to sort of speak truth to power in a way that everybody else can't. You'd had a very different discourse about what madness is. I mean, and take any kind of topic, right? The way that we sort of think about and categorize and understand and conceptualize a topic now, like crime and punishment, is very, very different than it would have been 400 years ago. So those are different discursive systems. But how did you get from A to B? And that's what Foucault is interested in. How did you get from understanding, madness as something caused by demons in the West to this medical understanding? And, the Enlightenment view is, well, we discovered science and we discovered truth. And that what we have now is truth, and what we had before was just superstition. And Foucault is not interested in what's true and what's not. He's more interested in understanding what that sort of discursive system of how we talk about things is, what constitutes that, and how sort of that changed through time, and also how disciplinary power operates in that discursive system that we have in contemporary times, because there's still power there that's trying to normalize subjects, right? I mean, the normalization, for example, in current medical practices in terms of mental illness is, we can cure you. We can make you normal, right? And I'm putting that in quotation marks. So what's sort of the power in that? And, Foucault would say, maybe, we're not as humane now as we think we are. Maybe we're not as enlightened now as we think we are. So for Foucault, a discourse, as I said, is not about what is true, what's the truth of mental illness, but it's about who gets to produce truth. Not who said this, is it true, is it correct, is it right, is it authentic? But Foucault is more interested in questions: who says these kinds of things? What are the unstated or assumed rules that govern what we can and cannot say? Who gets to create the categories, and to what end or what purpose? In other words, who produces truth? Who is normal? Who is abnormal? Who is lawful? Who is delinquent? Who is sane? Who is mad? Who is sexually normal? Who is perverse in a given time and place? It's not about saying what are the truth in these. It's about saying who gets to how do these categories get constructed? Who gets to define them? And what are their effects on people? And how do people internalize these and then create sort of normalized identities through them? That's really what Foucault is interested in. So to sort of look at how we get different discourses and how they change over time and how sort of we shift from sovereign to disciplinary power. Foucault has a really particular view on power. While in the past we had this kind of power over, this sovereign power that specific individuals possessed. I mean, this is kind of the dominant kind of power. But for Foucault in modern times, power is not predominantly something that individuals or institutions can just sort of possess. I mean, not to say that there aren't powerful people, right? But he's saying predominantly, this is how power operates. In many circumstances, someone or something cannot be said to have power over another. Rather, power for Foucault is relational and constantly circulating. He says, quote, "It is never localized here or there, never in anybody's hands, never appropriated as a commodity or a piece of wealth. Power is employed and exercised through a net-like organization." So Foucault, sort of in this society of disciplinary power, the society of normalization, where most of us behave in a certain way, not because we fear punishment, but because we've internalized that gaze and internalized sort of norms of behavior. That this is a kind of a decentralized capillary view of power circulation. So think of like the human circulatory system, okay? What Foucault is saying is that instead of like, a sovereign model of power where the heart would be like, do this, I'm controlling everything. The circulatory system is actually composed of millions of these little sort of super decentralized capillaries. Right? And for Foucault, that's where you really need to look to see disciplinary power operating. Look at these actual on-the-ground practices at the micro level of social interactions. This is where discourses are produced. In the hospitals, in prisons, in mental institutions, in schools, by the thousands of everyday practices by doctors, by prison guards, by psychiatrists, by teachers. Okay, so, for example, our definitions of sort of normal and abnormal in terms of psychiatry. I mean, there is kind of the DSM with its authoritative, this is what is defined, but where do those definitions come from? They don't just sort of spring fully formed from some sovereign power's mind saying this is how madness is defined, right? It sort of comes from the everyday practices of doctors and psychologists and therapists. And when you see changes, it's sort of how those practices sort of accumulate from the ground up. This is a very different notion of power than that kind of sovereign idea of power. So modern power operates to produce the phenomena it targets, according to Foucault. So in Foucault's account, this transition to modernity, this transition that the Enlightenment is bringing us through, is about the replacement of the law of the sovereign by the norm of society as the primary instrument of social control. Part of this too means for Foucault that power and knowledge are inextricably linked, that any society at any given time will have understandings about what kinds of labels, categories, behaviors are understandable and acceptable, and which are incomprehensible or unacceptable, right? Societies have dominant discourses about all these things. So power for Foucault, this is like big exclamation point, is intimately connected with how knowledge is produced. And this is something that becomes important for Edward Said in Orientalism. So again, for Foucault, there is no such thing as capital T truth, but only the interaction of power, disciplinary power, and knowledge to produce a certain set of discourses that get institutionalized as truth. Foucault says in an essay called Power Knowledge, quote, "Each society has its regime of truth, its general politics of truth, that is, the types of discourse which it accepts and makes function as true, the mechanisms and instances which enable one to distinguish true and false statements, the means by which each is sanctioned, the techniques and procedures accorded value in the acquisition of truth, the status of those who are charged with saying what counts as true." But this also means individuals can enact change, sometimes in emancipatory ways, to this power-knowledge relationship. Just like doctors, psychiatrists, teachers, parents, etc., who define and enact normalization, we can use the same systems of power-knowledge sort of circulation to alter the discourse. Change can be top-down, but also through small on-the-ground changes. I think of the way, Foucauldians have used this example, and we'll talk more about this when we talk about history of sexuality, but Foucault talks about sort of the emergence among doctors and psychiatrists of the category of the homosexual in late 1800s. Not that there weren't people who identified as men engaged in sexual practices with other men for all of human history, but this label homosexual with a particular set of behaviors and a particular psychology associated with it, and a particular way of analyzing it. This is something that as sex becomes medicalized, it emerges. But something interesting happens is that in kind of by the mid 20th century, people who have been labeled this and sort of analyzed as deviants and attempted to sort of fix them, that's all that kind of crap, actually take up the label and take up the identity and start organizing politically around that sort of label that had been placed on them, and start actually demanding rights and demanding equality. And the sort of modern gay rights movement, is organized around this common identity, right, of people engaged in sexual practices with individuals who identify as the same sex as they do. But around this label of, quote, the homosexual, which is a label that sort of emerges ground up through some of these normalizing practices of sort of science and psychiatry and medicalizing sex. People embrace that label and turn it around and organize politically around it, and eventually lead to some pretty positive political change. Most of the time, society of normalization doesn't work that way. But, this capillary model of power, as opposed to somebody like Marx, right, where it's just one giant revolution, and all of the sort of on the ground up changes don't really change anything. You have to throw over the whole system. Foucault is really offering us an alternative model, a different model, that change is possible through sort of subversion of the system is possible. Not likely, normalization is still really strong, but you can sort of change the categories, change the definition, change the discourse. Now, he's not going to say if one discourse is truer than the other, or one sort of way of looking at something like medicine or mental illness or prisons or sexuality is better than the other. But certainly we can say that is more liberatory. That is, I guess in de Beauvoir's terms, that is something that is more maximizing the freedom of more people, right? We can make that normative judgment. So it's a very different idea of power. And very much, tied to the Enlightenment too. So, one thing that we'll talk about is, all of these sort of Enlightenment ideas of looking at things like mental illness, looking at sexuality, looking at discipline and punish. Are we really more enlightened? Are things better? Or are we still subject to sort of normalization? What are the implications of that? And what can we do about it?